Okay, I'd like to welcome everyone to the August Canada Wildfire webinar. For those that are new here, my name is Karen Bluen. I am the research coordinator at Canada Wildfire. Welcome, and it's nice to have you here. As some of you may know, our webinar schedule has been a little bit off this year. So it has been a very crazy season in Canada and around the world. We've chosen to cancel or delay some of our webinars to allow the people who we try to reach out to the opportunity to attend live later in the season. The 2023 wildfire season has been trying, to say the least. I would like all of us who are here to take some time to remember and honor 4 lost heroes. My heart feels so heavy as I think of the 4 courageous souls that have been lost in the line of duty in Canada this year. They're all far too young to be gone, and to their family, friends, and coworkers, we see you. When we lose a member of the wildfire community, it echoes. It echoes through our agency, it echoes across our country, and it echoes across the world. We're all reminded of the risks and sacrifices in this line of work. Devyn, Adam, Ryan, and Zak, your heroism and sacrifice will forever be remembered. Rest in peace. I'd also like us to take a moment in recognition of the profound loss and devastation ongoing in Hawaii. 1,000 are still missing in Maui, over 50 are dead, and multiple fires are still burning. It has been a very trying season. An end is not clearly in sight. And with so many agencies in Canada turning to all hazard response, the thought of time to recover and recoup seems like a long shot. We're taking on more and more in this role. And I would like everyone to know that we appreciate the work being done and we care, we feel you. So with that, thank you for those of you who are able to join us. For those of you who are not able, this is being recorded. It will be posted to our YouTube channel at Canada Wildfire. And we hope that those who are unable to join us today are able to catch this later. I'd like to welcome Steve Cumming. Dr. Cumming is a professor at the University of Laval. He's going to be talking to us today about simulating fire regimes in SpaDES, parameter estimation for landscape fire modeling. Today, Dr. Cumming is going to be giving a presentation followed by a Q&A. If you have any questions, we're going to handle them in kind of 2 ways today. So if it's a point of clarification that you need in order to understand what's being presented, please interrupt. You can either interrupt by putting it in the chat, raising your hand, unmuting if you feel comfortable. If it's something that you would like a longer detailed explanation or a theoretical question, please post that in the chat and we will have a Q&A at the end of the presentation. So with that, I would like to hand this over to Dr. Cumming. Dr. Cumming, welcome and thank you for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me, and it's good to finally take a bit more active role in this network, where I haven't been as present as I would like to have had been in the past. The work that I'm showing today spans a period of many decades, and as we were reminded, some of this has probably been overtaken by events, but all the same, let me proceed with a bit of an overview. So the percolation models were advertised. I'm going to talk about those a little, and if there's any mathematicians present who care to correct any misrepresentations I may make, please feel free. Historical range or natural range of variation features importantly in the motivation for this work. I'm going to talk about it just a little bit for context for those of you who may not know about it. Then talk about fire regimes, and then SpaDES, what SpaDES is. And then the main topic of the objective of this talk is how can we reproduce fire regimes in the simulation? And then there'll be some live demonstrations. Good Lord, somebody's knocking at my door. I hope they go away. Where was I? Yeah, demonstration of fire regime simulation and some operational applications as well. So let's get to it. Where's my slides for controller? Here we go. So what is a percolation model? Imagine a grid of points that are possibly connected by arcs according to some topology, and here's a bunch of them here of the more usual forms: hexagon, square, triangle. Each point has a neighborhood to which it may be connected. Here's some examples of the kinds of neighborhood structures that are commonly used. The 4 immediate neighbors here, the von Neumann neighborhood, so-called, that has the 4 up, down, left, right, and the diagonals, and a larger, less immediate neighborhood of 24 neighbors, distance separated by distances 1 or 2. What makes it interesting is these arcs, they can be set on or off with some probability, introducing a connection. And when you do that, you can produce clusters. Here's some shown here. 2 points connected, 2 more points connected. Here's 5 points connected. This point's not connected to anything. So the question or the mathematical questions that concern theoreticians, what are the structure of clusters of connected points and how does that vary with P? What's the size distribution? Are infinite clusters possible, assuming, of course, the graph to be infinite? How big are the holes within clusters? What proportion of the landscape belongs to a cluster? And can water percolate to the end of the brick? That's one of the many applications to physical systems of this model, as well as combinatorics and graph theory. One of the applications is fire. This discipline goes back to the 70s at least, probably a lot earlier than that, but the earliest references I've run into are from the 70s. It's in a branch of advanced mathematics. Here's a book on the subject from the 90s, translated into Chinese, which is my little way of saying it may as well have been in that language in the first place for all the good it does the likes of me. The theory is not much of a guide to empiricists, I will say that, but it does provide a useful model for thinking about wildfires and for generalizing into possibly quite complex simulation tools. This is the first paper I ever looked at on the subject, fire propagation in 2D random media. And here's a simulation of fire spreading through a landscape iteratively. Here's on the left, on the left is what the result looks like after a few hundred time steps on a specific topology, I guess the 4-way topology, this one here. And if you change the topology to the 24 neighbor topology, neighborhood structure, you get quite a different pattern. An interesting thing to note, which is all usually glossed over in the theory, is where do fires start? So in this case, all the trees in the 2 bottom rows are ignited at time 0. We'll come back to that in a moment. Suffice to say, there's a spread model and an ignition model, which in theoretical papers is usually treated as an annoying incidental. Here's another paper, came out about the same year in 1984, looking at forest fires as critical phenomena, by which they mean there are circumstances when a fire will expand to cover pretty much all the available area. If, in the parlance of percolation theory, this percolation probability, the probability that 2 arcs will be connected, is high enough, fires will spread without bound. And this may have been the first paper to talk about that. I can't say I've done an exhaustive review of the subject, although such reviews certainly exist. But I want to talk about the generalizations of these very basic models. And here's one. First one I know about in the wildland fire literature, 1995, by a fellow named Armin Ratz. And this one introduces an interesting generalization to the spread probability. It can vary with age or time since fire. The older the forest gets under this model, the greater the likelihood of a fire spreading to a neighbor given that it's burning. So here is a graphical representation of what's going on again. I said again. Looky, there's a burning cell, and in the simulation representation of the percolation model, fires can spread from a burning cell to their unburned neighbors with some probability. In this case, that probability is here. on the y-axis, and it's allowed to vary with age. So interestingly, the paper was about the consequences in terms, it was about the kinds of landscape patterns of old and young forest that are produced by different degrees of age sensitivity. I'm not going to show the results, but it was probably the first instance to look at this in a spatial simulation approach. Johnson and von Wagner at about the same time published non-spatial versions, which also allowed for fire propagation, or at least fire initiation, to vary with age. Now we're getting to some more, slightly more recent, I guess 2000 isn't really recent anymore, fuel type and moisture. So we're adding new state to the model. The previous version by Rats had, in addition to the percolation process, the cells have a state, how old they are. Here's another case where they have a state, fuel type, and moisture class. This was a result of work done in response to the then unusual fire that burned in Yellowstone National Park in the 80s, burned half the place down, inspiring a great deal of research, including by these researchers at Knoxville, the U.S. Department of Energy Landscape Ecology Lab in Knoxville, Tennessee, where Gardner and Rami worked, I believe. Some of them in Hargrove and Gardner it was, to tell you the truth, if I remember correctly. And it was Gardner who sent me a version of the code that they used here years and years ago when I was a PhD student. So what they're doing is they're using cellular automaton to simulate percolation clusters, the formation of percolation clusters. Fires started here in the center, and they grow to different sizes and shapes and degrees of holes, I guess, imperfectly filling the space with the patterns that vary characteristically with the probability of spread, and some values here are shown. When you get up to 0.25 in models like this, you start to get big fires. You get much above 0.4 and you're burning the whole landscape pretty much all the time. Now, the point that's attracted many people to this simple model is that these subcritical clusters below the critical percolation threshold of about 0.5, where everything burns all the time, you start to get patterns that have some vague resemblance to the sorts of features that some real fires exhibit, including complex boundaries and incomplete burning skips, islands, or inclusions. Now, because they were working on real forests and were fire scientists and forest ecologists, they were concerned and knew perfectly well that in real fires, the spread behavior depends on what kind of tree it is, what kind of vertical and horizontal fuel structure you have, and also on the fuel moisture. The subject has been much in the news lately, in case anyone hasn't been paying attention. So they wanted to parameterize that behavior in the context of a percolation type model. They wanted to add state to represent fuel type and vegetation type, fuel type, moisture. And that means they had to somehow come up with probabilities associated with each of the states. So this is what they did. They came up with 3 matrices that represent the probability of spread from burning cell type 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 to an unburning neighboring cell of the same type. And they have actually 3 such matrices, 1 for each fuel class. So they got 5 cells, 5 fuel types. So they need 25 parameters because they have this asymmetric spread from lodgepole pine to fir, or the other way around, not symmetrical necessarily. And then they have to do it all over again for each of the 3 moisture classes: dry, medium, and wet. So there's a lot of parameters here. If we think back to what we saw on this slide here, we can see that most of the fire activity is going to be happening here, where the spread probabilities are 0.2-ish or so, here or here, and I'm thinking this is probably a error. I sure hope it's not in their code. Very high spread probability and inconsistent with the rest of the graphs. The point being, there's a lot of parameters to estimate here. Where did they come from? Well, they guessed. That is to say, they used their considerable knowledge of the system and a great deal of playing around, probably that they don't talk about, playing around with the model to come up with some parameters that seem to reproduce the phenomenon. The challenge of this approach is that it's not reproducible. If you ask them to do it again, they would not come up with the same numbers, very unlikely. And also not generalizable. These work for the subalpine plateau of Yellowknife National Park and would not apply anywhere else. I'm now going to consider another aspect of fires, namely intensity. The fire model of, well, the second physical model from 1984 was designed to work entirely on surface fires, where fire could be understood as a two-dimensional propagation problem. And this is an example from, I believe this is from the Porter Lake fire of 1984, up in the open lichen woodlands of the Northwest Territories, where you have a nice, dry, crunchy lichen tapis, and then the odd black spruce tree available to burn as the fire spreads along the ground and hits the bottom of the trees, and poof, up it goes, because the trees are connected to the fuels by continuous, the crown of the tree is connected to the surface by means of continuous fuel ladders in the form of branches that extend all the way to the ground. So the fire here is more intense than the fire here. Intensity, well, you probably all know better than I, it has to do with how much energy is emitted per unit distance, per unit length of fire front. This is low. This can be quite a lot. So the question that this particular study, generalization of the modeling approach, was asked to consider was, what was the fire regime like in the caribou in BC pre-European contact? And this is an opportunity to introduce to you the kind of data that I have in mind and that I'll be using implicitly throughout the rest of the talk. So these are fire management agency records represented here spatially. So we have spatially registered events. My statistician colleagues would call this a marked point process, or the realization of a marked point process. The events are the little dots, and the marks are things like the cause. The red dots are caused by lightning, the blue dots are caused by humans, and you can see that their spatial distribution is quite different. Human-caused fires tending to occur where humans go, and lightning not being constrained by roads and towns and settlements. The marks also include what year things happened, or the date for that matter, and other interesting features of which I'm mainly interested in the final size of the fire. That's the kind of data. This was the question at hand. This is a surface fire in an open forest, but the open forest is quite different from this one. In one very important respect, notice the canopy of the trees here extends straight to the ground. Here in ponderosa pine, unlike black spruce, there's a great big air gap. So a surface fire in fuels like this is very unlikely to extend into the canopy, causing much damage to the trees, which are furthermore protected by their gratuitously thick bark. So these are not going to be killed by the surface fire. This is a surface fire regime, and the forest is able to sustain itself under those circumstances. Once the trees start filling in, which has happened in Banff National Park and Jasper and throughout the Intermountain West in the States, because we stopped these surface fires from happening, well, you change the picture somewhat and you fill in with other species and create a more contiguous vertical and horizontal fuel profile, and the kaboom can happen. So the question was, could the forests in the caribou region ever have been like this? And in order to answer that question, was a matter of adding one new piece of information to the simulation, a intensity state, which then feeds back onto the forest. High intensity fires kill most of the trees, low intensity fires don't. With the right forest structure, a low intensity surface fire can leap into the canopy. And here's an example of what would have happened. The fire is ticking along, not really killing more than 5–10% of the trees, and then it hits a patch with the right structure and spreads into the canopy and kills everything in sight. So you can have quite variable behavior with this additional component added to the model. This was quite a limited approach in that the spread probability did not vary with the intensity, because that would be hard to do, but it was sufficient to show that surface fire regime maintaining open Douglas fir forest would have been entirely possible in this region, the interior Douglas fir zone of BC, until we stopped the locals from managing the landscape with fire, which they had done pre-contact. Leading result, the forest we've created now is very different from the forest that once existed, hence, and the forest management firm that contracted me to do this work were interested to know to what degree. So that work was 20 years old also, by the way, 2003. This is something brand spanking new from the year 2023 in Brazil. A near real-time system for predicting fire spread across the Cerrado. And I'm introducing this to show you that a simple cellular automaton model can become quite complicated if you add more state information to it. Fuel loads, topography, wind, fuel moisture. Here's just an example of how they model the effects of wind speed and direction on the probability of a fire spreading from a burning cell to its neighbor. And with this, they were able to reproduce pretty well, if you squint, the actual shape and size of some real observed fires. So this is, in effect, a discretized version of Prometheus burn pre-3 or something very much like it. So 20, 30, almost 40-year history of percolation models and fire spread. They can be very simple, or they can be generalized into quite complex cellular automaton models that are, in fact, whether this is recognized explicitly or not, numerical approximations to systems of partial differential equations. So where do you stop with this? Where do we get off this train? That depends on what you want the fire model to do. And I'm going to conclude this section by emphasizing that my purpose has always been to reproduce fire regime parameters for applications in conservation biology and ecosystem management using the simplest possible fire models that we can get away with. So part the second, the historical or natural range of variation, which is sort of a guiding principle from 30 years ago now again. And it's based on the following line of argument. Regional biota are, quote, adapted to the natural disturbance regime, of which the current landscape is but an instance. The landscape changes over time, and fires or whatever disturbance event you're concerned with keep coming up. But it changes within presumably some degree, some range. And sustainable management should be assured if the managed forest does not differ too much from the range of conditions that occurred under natural conditions. So we usually measure these by crude indicators like age structure or the amount of certain kinds of habitat, old growth commercial forests, for example. In recent years, HRV, historical range of variation, is distinguished from the original natural range of variation by the use of data from a defined historical period, usually pretty recently, because that's where the data come from. This was one reason for this was it didn't take long for somebody to say, well, natural, what's that? I mean, there used to be glaciers covering most of North America. There weren't no fires then. HRV removes the necessity to confront that considerable complexity. So historical ranges of variation and ecosystem attributes, how do you know what the distribution of amount of old forest was. Well, you get it by simulation experiment with a model that reproduces what you imagine are the key features of the fire regime. Let me stop for just a moment to acknowledge that climate change is perhaps making all this kind of quaint and beside the point, but I'm talking about what I've done to date, not what I might have done had I been paying attention to the climate over the past decades. Here's an example of historical range of variation study and the kind of reason you would do it. Study region in most of northern Alberta and part of British Columbia. Little red dots are pulp mills or sawmills, sources that require wood from the forest. And what we did, among other things, was first of all, estimate the range of natural variation in one particular indicator, the amount of old aspen mixed wood forest. And here they're shown on this here graph. This is the 0th percentile, the 10th, the 50th, the 90th, the 100th. And what we're asking is, when we manage the forest in some optimal forest management sense, how much does it cost us to stay within that range? Or put another way, would an optimal forest management plan take us out of it or not? And the answer is basically no, we can probably keep that forest in its range without spending tons and tons of money. In fact, at almost no cost at all. So that's an application of the HRV approach. The critical thing was, how did we get these numbers? We estimated them by simulation. So, begging the question, what is a fire regime? I use a definition from Whalen's Ecology of Fire, 1994, a quantitative description of the fire's characteristic of a particular place. And it's multivariate, or should be multivariate, in my opinion. The aspects, the attributes that I'm going to focus on today are fire frequency, by which I mean the rate of occurrence of a fire event. Not the frequency of burning of a particular cell, but the frequency of a fire starting, a fire arrival, as some would call it. So that's that, and then the size, how big do they get? And also the cause, which is pretty much either lightning or humans. There's some other attributes that are often referred to, the proportion of annual area burned, or its approximately, since bearing in mind some work by Reed from 2006, it's reciprocal, the fire return interval, but that's just frequency times size. So the critical regime attributes I'm concerned with are these three here. And the abstractions are as follows. We model frequency as a counting process of some time. Referring to marked point processes was the clue there. And we're going to assume for initially that these are almost a homogeneous Poisson process. A cause, we're going to call that lightning and forget about human caused fires for now. Also a slightly or more than slightly dated approach. I'll return to that towards the end of the talk. But the examples I'm going to show refer to lightning caused fires only. And then the size, I've chosen to characterize the size distribution as truncated Pareto in effect. First introduced by Strauss in 1989 in Forests, in the Journal of Forestry, I believe. So the parameters of this distribution are the minimum size, which conveniently enough would be the size of your model pixels. Normally, it doesn't have to be, but it's sure convenient to do that. The maximum size, and clearly fires have a maximum size because the world is finite, and then the mean. Those three are how we would characterize it. Someone will say Paretos may not have a variance or even a mean, but finite ones do. And these are finite because bounded because there's a maximum size that we can estimate from data. So fire regime, the stripped down version just defined. And now I'm going to talk about the simulator that I'm promoting here. SpaDES is called. This is a spatial discrete event simulator. And I'm going to first introduce, there's a lot here to talk about. I could talk about my friends who spent the last 5 years feverishly designing the thing. at the Canadian Forest Service. But I want to talk about one of the reasons we built it in the first place. And I'll do this by the following claim. If you think back on those 5 or 6 studies, the early fire percolation simulation experiments using computer programs to simulate the process of percolation, and the more elaborate models produced, culminating with that 2023 example, a span of 40 years almost, I predict that the authors couldn't replicate those studies today to save their lives. And even if they could, they wouldn't be able to update it or run them on a new location without a great deal of effort that they wouldn't do. The Brazil people from Brazil, because that paper was published in 2023, probably they could replicate it, although don't count on that. It has a way of being a lot more difficult to do than you would imagine if you haven't actually tried to do it. One of the main objectives of SpaDES is to change this, to make ecological modeling reproducible and generalizable. So what is SpaDES? It's an ecosystem of R packages for reproducible science, with the primary objective being ecological forecasting. In SpaDES, complex ecological models are built out of simpler components, collections of standalone modules, one or more. And modules, well, those are sets of asynchronous self-scheduling events. Burn some forest and then burn it again next year. Modules, such as the modules, interact only via shared data. They don't touch each other's code. All they do is take data from one module and feed it to another after making some changes to it. This allows teams with disparate expertise to work together. The insect ecologists, the vegetation people, and the fire guys can all collaborate without having to know very much about what the others are doing. All they have to do is agree on what the interface is between their models. These relationships and dependencies are defined by metadata conventions, and in the question period, I can show you how that is implemented syntactically in R. One of the advantages of doing this in R could have been done in Python too, but we decided to go with R 10 years ago when we first started thinking about this. Advanced statistical modeling, geoprocessing, data science tools, graphics, language interfaces to C++ or Python or pretty much anything. All that comes along free with R, instead of having to write it yourself, like most modelers have had to do in the past. And it's scalable. Thanks to advanced caching technology and support for parallel computation, an enormous effort devoted by Elliot McIntyre and others on the development team to make some of the low-level routines very fast and efficient. It's possible to run this thing replicatably over very large areas, all of Canada, as befits an organization like the Canadian Forest Service with a national mandate. So all that's kind of slick and computing sciencey, but the part that's ecological, the part that's scientifical, is this in red. Models are meant to estimate their parameters from local data via an initialization event or module. That's the fundamental difference between SpaDES and the SpaDES approach and other modeling efforts in the past, all the ones I'm aware of. Parameter estimation for the ecological models is done once off to the side, and then you run the model with those parameters, but there's no connection to data. It's not easy to redo the work somewhere else at another location, nor is it easy, to all practical intents, it's often impossible to update the model when new data comes available, as over the course of decades, it inevitably does. There's a whole bunch of resources here that describe how SpaDES works. Western Boreal Initiative is the biggest example to date of its use in a big integrative modeling study. The Git repo for SpaDES is here with a README you should look at, various resources for learning how to use it, and a whole bunch of publications that present the manifesto and some of the work that's been done, the actual modeling work done to date, which I won't dwell on except to refer you to them should you be interested. Here's a graphical representation input data like climate, species biomass, historical fire data, gets chewed through some statistical analyses to generate parameters for a whole bunch of more or less independent modules. Here's a vegetation dynamics module that interacts with a fire module, and there's also insect defoliators and human activity, harvesting, roads, and economic development of various kinds, which generate a landscape of forest and human disturbances, which changes its attributes over time, which in turn drive statistical models that predict bird distribution or caribou habitat or something like that from the landscape state. That's the overall idea. Here's an instance of its use at scale in what's called, well, a big part of the Northwest Territories, the boreal and taiga plains. In this particular example, the interest was in caribou populations in response to climate warming. And this is an output of the vegetation dynamic models under a variety of climate change scenarios, summarized as the mean change in above ground tree biomass over 100 years. So it does work at scale, not without some effort, but it does do it. So with that in mind, let me now hone in on the SpaDES framework for fire regime simulation that I'm demonstrating today. And that basically relies on ideas of indirection. And this is the part that I've always had the most greatest difficulty explaining, and I'm not sure I'm going to do that great of a job today, but see what I can do to try. So I mentioned modules. Here is a module called SCFM regime, SCFM being the name of the suite of modules that do this work. Regime estimates fire regime parameters. In order to do that, you need to have given the definition, which I did earlier, ignition rates, causes, and size distribution attributes. Min size, mean size, maximum size. So SCFM regime's job is to estimate those parameters from data for a particular landscape. Here's one that I just tried for the first time a few hours ago. Fairly substantial chunk of territory just west of Great Slave Lake, where I've done an awful lot of work lately on vegetation dynamics in relation to fire regime. And it's got lots of fires, so it's going to give you an exciting demonstration when I get around to showing it to you. A thing to note, this work that I'm showing you today represents a little bit of a compromise between the simplest percolation models, wherein the landscape is homogeneous, and the complicated ones that we actually use in real life, where the vegetation varies, and therefore the fire behavior varies, and the fuel moisture varies with annual weather. We throw all that out and just say, is this all flammable or is it not? And the reason for that is you have to do at least that much, because Canada's forests are full of lakes that don't burn. And if you don't account for the effect of impermeable or non-flammable cells in your landscape, your models don't work very well. And they behave very differently in one place than another. Because if you look at a map of Canada, you'll notice that the amount of land, the amount and shape of lakes and other non-flammable things like glaciers and mountaintops, well, it's highly variable from place to place. So you have to account for it somehow. How we do that, I will explain in a bit. So this is the first part. Go from the data and the landscape/study area to the fire regime parameters, estimated by statistical means. Second part is a little bit more hard to explain. Here's the parameters that we just estimated. What do we do with them? So in our modeling toolkit, we've got a bunch of things that we could use to simulate fires. And in this instance, we have some way of starting them using a Bernoulli trials on a matrix, on a grid of estimated probabilities, which are 0 when the cell is non-flammable, like in the middle of a lake, and some other value that you estimate from data otherwise. So you've got a fire starting tool and you've got a fire spreading tool. And SPADES uses a low-level SpaDES tool called, I forget what it's called, in fact, SPADES-2 maybe, that simulates the behavior of a percolation process to grow fires on the landscape up to some limit. So the point is that the ignition modules and the spreading tool, they have their own parameters, and those parameters are not the same as the fire regime parameters. So what the driver does is systematically go from the parameters of the fire regime to the parameters of the toolkit so that the tools will reproduce the fire regime parameters in simulation. And I'm going to prove to you that this works, or at least in this instance, it works with some examples in a bit. The intellectual part of this is drawn in purple. The part about what are your fire regime parameters is also an intellectual part, but we'll pass over that lightly for now and say the intellectual part is how can I use these tools best how can I best use the available tools to reproduce the fire regime parameters? And once I figured out how to do that, I still need the toolkit parameters, which the driver produces from the regime estimate. So it's broken things down into two parts, describe the regime, and then turn the regime into something that you can simulate. And that separation introduces a very great deal of power, which I will be able to demonstrate just a little bit. I'm not going to talk about the statistical details much, except for this part here. The biggest challenge of modeling fire in a percolation framework is determining the relationship between the spread probability, P, and the fire size distribution. How does the mean fire size vary with P? Well, it's pretty much obvious that it's increasing, in fact, that it's monotonic increasing. But other than that, there's no theory to really tell us what this shape should be. Here's an example of a fitted curve. I'm going to tell you how I got it in a moment. Let me see. The curve, the greater the spread probability, the bigger the fires are going to be. But the shape of the curve depends on the landscape because the amount and proportion of lakes and other non-flammable areas, and secondarily the shape and how you decide to treat buffering and boundaries and edge effects and all that, those all have a big effect on the relationship. And there's no way that I know of to deduce it or derive it mathematically from any summary of the landscape. You have to simulate your way to a curve. And the way we do it, we take our landscape and we crop and buffer it, and then we drop a very large number, like tens of thousands maybe, of sample fires on it and grow them at randomly selected locations with randomly selected spread probabilities, which generates a great big cloud of points, which we then put a special kind of generalized additive model through it called a shape-constrained GAM. And these ideas come, let me specifically mention my colleagues, Reg Kulperger and Doug Wolford. So we in SpaDES have implemented their ideas. You take that big sample of fires, there's a cloud of points that I actually can't show you because the model diagnostics at the moment don't produce it. And we run this curve through it, and that curve, the shape constrained GAM, how is it constrained? It's constrained to be monotone increasing. And that gets you a nice smooth curve like this, a calibration curve, which you can use, I will show you how in a moment, to get the p-value that you want. Now, this takes hours and hours or days to run, so I'm not going to be able to show it to you today, but I'm going to show you an example, first of all, of a live demonstration that uses a simplified version of this whole procedure, and then some results from some real work using some results of a couple of studies where the full-blown tool was used. So a live demonstration. I've seen these fail so very often. This was working 2 hours ago and last night and last week, which pretty much guarantees is going to fail right now. I'm going to try it on a new landscape that I just defined using the eco regions, eco districts of Canada these three areas here are 1 eco-district, 242, whatever. I can't read the little numbers, unfortunately, but these three here, and we are going to simulate fires in this big chunk of the Northwest Territories, here, here, and here. Okay. Secretly, here's some output of the model. I'm just going to run it from scratch. This is the part where I tell it which eco-districts particularly are the study area, by the way. So this is all R code and RMD files. Let's see if we can get it to work. So it's initial, here we go. Only took a few minutes, a few seconds to get going because secretly, most of the hard work was done this morning and the results were cached. So you don't have to do a lot of the calibration but once. So here's a outline of the landscape cropped as a landscape land cover raster cropped to the study area as defined by the eco-regions, eco-districts I chose to define my study region. Here it's reclassified into the flammable blue and the non-flammable red. And then there's an initial age map. And now we're tracking the simulated fires, which grow or are started every year according to these random probabilities that we estimate. You can't really see the little dots very well on this image, and I did not have the time to make it prettier. So I've just saved a blow-up version of a simulated fire so you can see what the graphics actually look like if you could see them up close. So these here are two fires. We can see in green where the fire started, and then in yellow where it spread or did not spread from its cell of origin, and then subsequent growth in red. Now I could run this model some more, or if someone's super excited about this in the interactive section in a few moments, I can try running it on a whole different study area and you'll see what you see. So shifting back to away from the live demonstration and to some canned results, here's some applications of this specific modeling approach. Some applications of this specific modeling approach to HRV estimation studies. There have been three major ones that I know of. One, an NRCan initiative called the, what does REI stand for? I don't even remember. Some ecological initiative that NRCan had in northeastern BC. In Alberta, estimation of historical range of variation on behalf of the Forest Research, FRI, I even forget what FRI stands for. I've been away from Alberta so long. Foothills Research Institute, and the LandWeb project that financed in part some of the early development of SpaDES. And most recently, something that my colleague Alex Chibati is doing under contract for the BC MOF, estimating historical ranges of variation in the Caribou region, which includes the study area around Williams Lake that I showed you earlier, where the fire intensity, crown fire, surface fire modeling was done. So here's some results. This is just a map of the study area with administrative units for reporting. Here's the study area blown up and buffered a little bit. And these are the 5 different regions for which they wanted estimates. They want to characterize the study regions for these polygons 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, which for those in the know would represent, BC's what does it stand for? BEC zones in BC, bioecoclimatic zonations or bioecoclimatic ecosystem zonations. And they wanted separate HRV estimates for each of the 5 different BEC zones that are found. So notice that we can do this for discontinuous polygons, right? The zone 3 is actually 3 big parts and a bunch of little ones. Zone 2 is many polygons. Zone 1 is very many polygons indeed. this method. Doesn't matter how many polygons you have, they don't even have to be contiguous. It's pretty cool, although it does introduce some problems, which I will illustrate a bit later. And here's some of the results. Let's start with the estimated number of ignitions. We're plotting how many we estimated from the data versus how many were reproduced. And it should be no surprise, it would be no surprise if I'd explained to you the details of how the estimation is done, and how it's simulated. The simulated and estimated have to be almost exactly the same unless there's a bug. It's because the Bernoulli approximation to a Poisson distribution is very good when the parameters are small, which happens when your pixels are pretty small, which they are here. 6.25 hectares, I believe. What's the probability that a fire will escape from its cell of origin and exceed the minimum size? Those are estimated here, recorded not as a probability, but as the number expected. And that's also on a straight line. We reproduce the minimum fire size very well. The historical mean fire size is reproduced a little less well, but still pretty good. You'll see the historical mean for polygons 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 plotted on the y-axis, x-axis, and the simulated mean on the y-axis, x and y. And most interestingly, here's the estimated fire return interval from the data. Very, very long because there's no fires, or until recently, there were very few fires in this region. And as simulated, and in most cases, the as simulated tracks very, very well the as estimated, with one noticeable exception emphasized in violet. Let's see what's going on there. The simulated fires are a lot smaller than they're supposed to be, which makes the estimated fire return interval a lot longer than it's even longer than it's supposed to be. Let's take a look at what's going on there. Next slide, please. Oh, actually, we're going to get to that in a different slide. Pardon me. I have a simpler explanation of the problem coming up. So instead, let me talk about the calibration part. I showed you that calibration curve, which is estimated anew for every single landscape. So separately for each of these 5 polygons, representing the 5 fire zones. Here's one for polygon 2. The way that we use this calibration curve is we take on the y-axis the desired target mean fire size, and we run along the x-axis until we hit it. And we drop a perpendicular, and there is the desired, or there is the requisite spread probability that accounts for the shape and the lakes and all of that stuff. And most of the time, this works very well. We get it by applying Newton's method to by using Newton's method with the predict method for the model, for the SCAM. And that works. Newton's method works because the SCAM enforces monotonicity. This actually was enormously difficult to achieve without recourse to scams. Almost, in fact, I would say couldn't be done. So that's how we do it. We get our calibration curve, our target mean fire size, and boom, out comes the P that reproduces the mean fire size, which, let me remind you, it pretty much does in most circumstances. Here's another instance. Here's the green polygon for zone whatever 2 and the zone 3 in blue. Notice that the curves are quite different in shape. They're both monotone increasing, and they're both means fires are very small for low values of P and increase with high values of P, but the rate of increase in the shape of the curve differs in very substantially. And it's really important to get that part right, which I believe we have done. Winding up here, this is another example for somewhere random in Alberta. We have, for diagnostic purposes, the ability to generate random study areas, which we intersect with some ecological classification. This one's from Alberta. I don't know what they are. This region's about 300 kilometers north to south and about the same east to west, so it's not small. It's got 3 distinct polygons, polygon fire regions, blue, red, and green. Notice the red is actually divided into 2 pieces, separated by a big expanse of green. Once again, we reproduce the estimated ignition rate exactly. Here's the fire polygons. Up here's the calibration curves. And I just want to draw attention to this curve's a little bit, I mean, it's monotone, but it's a little bit discontinuous. A second derivative graph would look a little odd. And it's probably because we didn't use enough data points to fit it. The optimal approach to actually generating these calibration curves is something that needs a fair bit of work still. Be a great master's project, although perhaps kind of boring, to figure out under specific circumstances whether the curve was good enough or whether you needed to increase the sample size. We have rules of thumb for that developed through practice, but not really enough work. Really enough work hasn't been done yet. And one of the examples of that is this mean fire size part. Number 1 is a little bit off. And the reason for that is these 2 regions are separated. And they're separated, so fires can't really spread from this side into that side without they pass through 2. And 2 has its own distinct spread probability. So neighborhood effects and topography effects do limit the accuracy with which we can reproduce fire regime parameters in some circumstances. It comes up when you have disjunct fire zones like shown here. But otherwise, in most cases, it works real well. So, yeah, the use of this particular version of the SpaDES fire models is actually fairly common in actual applications that might have policy implications, which is one of the reasons I agreed to do this talk, is to help me organize the manuscript that I really need to write to explain everything in some detail. But I have a few minutes left to talk about all the things that it doesn't do and could do with a little bit more effort. So let me talk about some of them, because one of the interests, I believe I even stated this in an earlier slide, I'm interested in how far can we push these really, really simple models. If you ever look at stochastic processes or something, it doesn't take much additional structure to add a lot of complexity. And as we've seen, just by separating out the ignition from the spread, we've been able to get a fair distance there. But let me talk about some more things that would be easy to do within this framework with hardly changing a thing. Annual counts are use a Poisson model, but in fact, annual fire counts are over dispersed. The Poisson approximation is not good. A negative binomial model is better, and that just means there's a Poisson distribution within years, but the rate parameter varies according to a gamma distribution, perhaps. Or it could vary parametrically through annual fire weather. Either of these would be easy to estimate from data. It means you have to complicate the definition of the regime a little bit to account for ignition is now something that's with a rate parameter that's time varying in some way. And then the driver would need to be modified to create an annual ignition probability map instead of just one fixed ignition probability map for every simulation year. This would be, in fact, I'm looking for a master's student to do exactly this for me. But it's you know, some amount of work, a master's degree amount of work to do it, but not by any means a massive challenge. This graph on the right is illustrating 2 different things, one of which is just the variation in log n, the number of fires per year for some large part of the Northwest Territories over, what's this, 50 years of data, roughly. this variation is not Poisson excess, so excess over dispersion, which is why I brought the subject up. I'm going to come back to that in a moment, because the mean fire size always varies, also varies by what's this, 6, 7, more than almost 4 orders of magnitude between years. So it's not really quite reasonable to say that the fire size distribution is temporally doesn't vary from year to year. Obviously, everyone knows it does. One could extend the model also to account for that. If you had some way of varying systematically the mean size from year to year, either through some random mixture model or parametrically through fire weather. That'd probably be the easiest thing to do. Going back to the calibration procedure, gee, if the fire weather this year, if the mean fire size this year is supposed to be 1500, well, gee, I'll just do the same Newton's method procedure and get this year's parameter or this year's parameter. There's no big difficulty in extending this to time varying fire spread probabilities. The thing that's less trivial is that if you look at this graph here, you can see that the variation in mean fire size and mean in number of fires, don't vary independently. They're partially correlated. The R squared on a log scale is about 0.4, I think. So this introduces some quite significant statistical challenges. There's a method called copulas that would enable one to approach this, and some people in CFS are starting to do it. So it would be possible to even extend this method to account for correlation in the time varying parameters of the fire regime, namely annual fire frequency and annual fire size. And that would be well worth doing, because the point of this is to estimate, in effect, HRV, range of variation, but that's just another way of saying tail risk. And as the financial community found to their loss, if you don't get the correlations between different parts of your model correct, you're going to bankrupt the world or burn up your forests unexpectedly. So it's worth putting some effort into that. Further to that, the size distribution characterization in terms of a mean, a maximum, and a minimum is not perhaps adequate. This graph here is meant to show that we don't reproduce the median as well as we reproduce the mean. We reproduce the mean real well, but the median, I'm not sure, probably not. So there's room to improve that. How one would improve it exactly, I'm not entirely sure. And finally, this simple-minded approach, it works anywhere in Canada, or it will work almost anywhere in Canada, provided there's at least a reasonable number, for some unknown value of a reasonable number of historical fires available to fit the fire regime parameters. The data means are quite modest. So in particular, you could apply it pretty straightforwardly in USA and Australia. And by means of the remote sensing data products that are now available for several decades, you could do it in the Palearctic boreal or Russia or South America for that matter, which I hope to do over the next few years. And again, let me say, this is a useful method for generating quick and dirty approximations of fire regimes, not all the details that one might want. Now, yeah, 2 more slides. It doesn't do everything. I never said it did, and there's a couple of things to point out, particularly missing regime attributes, lightning versus human, and seasonality, spring versus summer. So the examples I've showed only use lightning fires. They extract the lightning fire records from some online database and fit the model from that. You would like to do human caused fires as well, but you got to do them separately because their distributional parameters are all, their size and frequencies are all different. So you have to do them separately. And it turns out there's a bit of a thing we didn't think about in SpaDES that's making that difficult. We haven't resolved it yet, but clearly we need to, because when I started doing this work in grad school, you could neglect human-caused fires in much of the boreal, but that hasn't been the case for some time now. And we need to get with that program. Seasonality just comes to the same problem. And of course, I would just like to conclude by saying we are very aware of the need to model fuel type and moisture dependencies, and the more mature model, the more complicated models that we use in many applications, generically known as fire sense, are just a fuel and moisture sensitive variation of the models that I've explained today. It's just that the estimation procedures are much more involved. So they're not suitable for teaching purposes or to explain any kind of detail today. So I will just pass on that and say thank you for your attention and ask what questions you may have.
Thank you, Dr. Cumming. That was great. Before I pose the first question to you, may I ask you to please post, you had a bunch of SpaDES resources on one of your slides, I believe 8 or 9. If possible, at some point, could you post them in the chat?
Oh, yeah.
Or additionally, you can email them to me after, and I can send those out to all of the participants.
I'm going to send you the PDF of the slideshow, and that will have links in it.
Okay, so I will, if everyone's okay with that, if anyone doesn't want to be sent it, just post it in the chat, but I'm going to fire that out to the participants after, so you can access those resources that were hyperlinked in the presentation. So we have a few questions in the chat. The first participant is saying, I'm curious on the importance of being able to reproduce the results of a fire spread model and why it's important that SpaDES enables it to be reproduced.
Why is reproducible science important? I'm going to begin with that. Let me bring it back to another project I work on involving building bird models. It turns out that we have had difficulty when you're publishing a scientific paper with some results in it, you're in principle should be able to reproduce those results. Somebody working from the same data and the same assumptions should be able to get the same results as you did. In particular, my own research group should be able to go back to the same data, apply the same methods, and get the same results. And if you can't, you have a methodological problem, or you made an error somewhere, and you're not really contributing to the progress of science to the extent that you should. So reproducibility is fundamental. It's just, in practice, quite remarkably difficult to achieve it, especially as your models become more and more complex. That's why there's so much emphasis on it.
Perfect, thank you. Yeah, especially, I can see there maybe being this question coming from people who work in a more practical sense of fire management, not having thought in their practical job about the rigors needed in order for publications and stuff in the scientific community, and how quite often we're building on other people's studies. And in order to build on other people's studies, we need to be able to understand and reproduce those studies theoretically. So great answer. I don't see any other questions in the chat yet. Please feel free to post them in there, but I have a few questions myself. I have many notes here. So my first question would be, you talked about how you're only taking lightning caused fire currents into account so far. So if we're moving forward and we're looking at integrating in human caused ignitions and also looking at seasonality, is there a way that this model is able to handle confounding factors between those two new additions?
Well, assuming we could solve the little technical glitches right now preventing us from running both human and lightning at the same time, are you asking, do the fires interact?
My question would be that if we look at certain areas of Canada and we look at just cause distribution, there's often a seasonality trend to the cause of fire.
Yep.
So
yep.
You might have some confounding, or you might kind of be double accounting in some ways. I was just curious if there had been any thought to take that into account.
I've given it some thought. I haven't come up with a conclusion yet. The simplest thing would be to say, well, mostly the spring fires are human caused, at least in Western Canada, that's the case. So you don't need to handle both. Equally, you could separate out the human from the lightning caused spring fires and the human from the lightning caused summer fires. If you can do 2 classes of fire, you can do 4, 8, or 10. Of course, the more classes you have, the more data you need to estimate all the parameters. And then, human caused fires, their spatial distribution is trickier to model because it depends on human behavior and accessibility and all kinds of stuff that changes more rapidly, perhaps. And there's a lot of work been done on it, and we haven't replicated any of that work to date, which isn't to say it couldn't and shouldn't be done. We just haven't gotten to it.
All right, thank you. One of the participants would like to add to the question about reproducibility that iteratively updated models and data require reproducibility to allow the models to be rerun with new data, et cetera, which is a great point.
Yeah, I did mention that very briefly in one slide, but thank you, Alex, for bringing that up again. The data sets that I used to show the data sets that I used to demonstrate in the Northwest Territories, that was probably done in 2017 or 16. There's 6, 7 more years of fire data now available, however many years have suddenly passed. You would certainly want to be able to use the latest data when you fit the model, or at least have the ability to specify which period of time to use. For teaching purposes, I use a sort of pickled version of the National Fire Database in real life. What SpaDES does is it goes and downloads it and sees, has it changed since the last time? And if so, it uses the most recent version, unless you tell it not to. The point being that the models are supposed to reinitialize themselves when the input data changes, whether that input data be an expanded fire history due to the passage of time or some other kind of improvement. You want to be able to re-estimate the parameters for a new place and a new time without having to get another grad student to spend 4 years doing it.
Thank you. Thank you. Pardon if this question isn't on point. This is not my area of expertise, but at one point you mentioned that you have all these different inputs, if you will, into this model. So we're looking at regime, but you also mentioned that you have a fire spread module or within it. And I was just curious, is weather, I know you said climate change hasn't been taken into account, but how is weather considered?
In the model that I'm showing you today, weather is not considered. But in another version of the model that I'm just going to illustrate here, somewhere. Yeah. The live version that we use in most of our applications for real ecological forecasting uses a variation of the models that I described today, a generalization where the ignition probabilities and the spread probabilities vary spatially and temporally with fuel type and annual fire weather as measured by monthly drought code. The actual choice of month depends on the results of an automated parameterization procedure, because it might be July in Ontario and June in Alberta. But the kinds of relationships that are uncovered and used to drive the model are shown on this graph here, which shows the relationship between fire frequency, events per unit area, and time as a function of monthly drought code in July, going from wet to pretty dry for 4 different fuel types: hardwood, conifer, recently disturbed, and wetlands. And as you can see, the relationships are different and important in ways that would be important if you ignored them. So this part's relatively simple. The estimation of the fuel and vegetation type spread probabilities is extremely difficult. But we have probably got that working reliably. We just haven't tested it out as thoroughly in as many parts of the country. That works ongoing. The thing about SCFM is the methods are just kind of like linear regression. It's going to work every time, no matter what data you throw at it. The fuel and vegetation sensitivities are more difficult because of the nonlinearities at every step of the way. So you can't expect that your first effort at a general solution is going to work everywhere all the time. We haven't fully tested it yet. But that is, as I say, is ongoing. We have several initiatives to really implement and test these models, not just in Western Canada, but also in Ontario and Quebec and the Maritimes. Not that they burn much except this year. There's another lesson here, by the way. When I was doing work, first of all, in the interior of BC back in the early 2000s, they told me, never mind about fires, there haven't been any. And sure enough, you look at the data, there had been very few fires from the 50s, 60s, and 70s and 80s. You can't count on that anywhere, clearly. So the relevance of a landscape fire model is parameterizable from data, I would say, is greater than ever.
Thank you. I would agree. So I have one last question just for myself to understand. When we're looking at the percolation model and we have our ignition or fire arrival, and then we see that first, yellow spread direction, and then it grows into red. Is the predominant driver then for where the fire spreads fuel and topography if things like predominant winds are not taken into account?
In this version, it's just completely spatially random. The only effect is that water bodies, non-flammable areas, in effect, cause a bit of a shadow. In the fuel type and climate sensitive version, I don't have any pictures handy to show you the kind of results that produces, but then fire tends to follow the flammable vegetation and wherever the annual moisture conditions are favorable. So some years you'll have lots of fires in northern Quebec and some years you won't because the drought code varies from year to year. Now, like I said, it's possible to make these models sensitive to things like wind direction and speed and topography and all that, but you're then veering away from modeling a fire regime to modeling a specific fire, which is also very important, but not the same purpose. We're interested in how does fire as such affect the ecology of this system, and for that purpose, you need about the right amount of fires and about the right place, burning about the right things. It doesn't matter that one fire has one shape and another fire difference. Those differences are probably not as important as the primary drivers, which are how many, how big, and what do they burn.
Okay, thank you very much. I think most people in here would know this, but I would just like to put it on record that, and you can confirm, this is a freely available package that people can have in R. Is that correct?
All the SpaDES is on public Git repos. SCFM also. There's several different versions. There's a simple one I use for teaching, which I will put up as soon as I update it. I mentioned that one of the powers of SpaDES is that it uses R, which means you have access to all this geomatics stuff. The problem arises when the SpaDES community decides, when the R community decides that they're going to go from raster SP to Terra, which means we have to change everything that touches on rasters. And I haven't gotten around to doing that yet, and I probably won't until I absolutely have to, which is when I teach it the course again next year. So my toy version will be available soon. I don't know where SCFM is sitting right now, but I will add that Git repo to the list before I share it with you.
Awesome, thank you. I see a bunch of thank yous pouring in. Does anyone have any last minute questions? We do have a few minutes left. You can feel free to unmute yourself as well if you would like, remembering that this is recorded if you would like to say anything. Give it a minute. That was a great talk. It's very interesting. I don't have any experience working in fire regime modeling. The small amount of experience I do have is, which was probably very evident to you, in modeling actual fires. Hence all of my questions for more of a fire behavior and fire growth modeling perspective. So it was really interesting to me to kind of do this whole zoom out and look at the bigger picture. And you did a fantastic job describing it in a digestible way. So thank you very much for that. I appreciate you taking the time to come and talk and be a part of our webinar series. As I mentioned, this will be put onto our YouTube channel sometime next week. And if anyone has any questions, Dr. Cumming, do you want to post your email in the chat, or would you like me just to get them to send them to our generic email address? I see him typing. So Dr. Cummings is going to post his email in the chat. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to him. We're also available at wildfire@ualberta.ca, which I will type right now. You can send any questions there as well. Next month, we're going to have a presentation on a grasslands fuel database. So I look forward to seeing you all in September. Stay safe out there and have a great weekend, everybody.